It's good to be back here worshiping with you. It seems like it's been a long week. It seems like we've been away for a long time no see. It's so good to be back here. And I had a very busy week. I'm sure all of you had a very busy week as well. Some of you may have noticed that our church had a lot of visitors recently. We had a lot of visitors coming through, different teams. And I've said it before, but I think a lot of times it's easy for us because, we're here all the time. For many of us, we're here every week, throughout the week multiple times. Sometimes it's easy to forget what a high reputation our church has, Myungsung Church has, outside of these walls, outside of this country even. If you go overseas, in the highest places of religion and the highest places of education, the name Myungsung Church carries a lot of weight and a lot of prestige. And all the people that come here, when they visit, they're just so blessed. They're so touched by our service. I was sitting behind, last Sunday, I was sitting behind two of the vice presidents from Princeton Seminary. And when our choir, when our 찬양대 began singing, I saw them, they just looked at each other, they said, wow. They were just blown away by this wave of worship that washed over them. And the number one question I get from many people that are visiting our church, they say, is today special? Is something going on today? Did you prepare something? Was it because we're here? And I said, no, this is just another Sunday. It's just another Sunday, but every Sunday is special for us. We prepare like this for every Sunday, every Wednesday, every early morning prayer. This is how we prepare. This is our style. See, our church is a church that's healthy and full of blessing on the inside for all of our members. Yes, that's important. But it's also a church that is full of blessing for those outside our walls. Because a healthy church is a church whose blessing spills outside, right? It's not neat. It spills out. It spills and the cup overflows. The blessing flows out from this place. And our blessing is always flowing out to those outside of our walls. So again, for me, it was such a huge blessing to be able to host many of these visitors. And one of the best parts of hosting them is that sometimes, we have to take them, our team has to take them to meetings and events that they need to go to, around Seoul. So for me, it's a chance to see Korea, the parts that I haven't seen, which is all of it, because all I've seen is Myungil-Dong. So it's a chance for me to explore. And this past week was the same. We had the opportunity to take them to Yongsan. And I'm sure many of you have been to Yongsan already a million times, but for me, it was the first time going to Yongsan. And I said, wow, there's a place like this in Korea too. Yongsan is a very peculiar area. It's a very, how do you say, 독특한 in Korean, right? It's a very unique area. Very, especially Gyeongri-Dan-gil, right? It's hard to say. Gyeongri-Dan-gil is I was like, wow. It feels like Korea, but it also feels like a foreign country. It's like somewhere in between. And I learned about the history of Yongsan as we were going through it. I learned a little bit about the history of that area and that region and what it means to the Korean people. Because I found out it used to be occupied by the Chinese troops, right, way back. And then afterwards, it was occupied by the Japanese troops during the colonization. And then after the Japanese troops were defeated and they left, the American troops went in and it was in their hands most recently. And now I heard they're in the process of handing over Yongsan back to Korea. And it's not complete yet. There are some parts that are staying under American control, but that land is coming back into Korean hands. And that's a very important thing, isn't it? That's a very historic moment. Because land is very important. Land is very important. The concept of land. Land is what provides for our food. Land is what provides us with shelter. Land is what drives our economies, something that's on our minds very frequently nowadays. Land, if you look at history, is what causes most wars. Most fights are over land. And in many ways, land is the key part of human history and civilization. And what drives, right, that history forward is the land, how people interact with the land, these countries. And for the patriarch of the faith, for Abraham, land was something that was very important to him too. Not because he was greedy, but because land is a reality of our lives. We need land to live, and we need good land to live. And for Abraham, the land was important, and it was not just important to him, but it was important to God. Because land was part of the covenant promise made to Abraham. When God made that promise with Abraham, he promised him land. Not just the son, not just descendants, but land. And the covenant promise, if you're familiar with Genesis, is made 4 separate times in Genesis, chapter 12, 15, 17, and 22. And if you look at those covenant promises repeated 4 times throughout Genesis, in each one of them, land is something that God mentions. It's not Abraham bringing it up. It's something that God mentions. It's not like Abraham is like, oh, by the way, God, like, okay, having a son is nice, but, how about a nice piece of real estate, right? It's God that brings up the land. He promises, he offers it to Abraham. He says to him, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. He says, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies. So this covenant, the promise that God gave to Abraham, it wasn't just regarding bloodlines and blessing to the nations, but it was about land. It was about land. And for the Jewish people, this promised land was Canaan. It was the land flowing with milk and honey, the promised land. This past week, we also had the privilege of hosting the chancellor and former president of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, founded by Albert Einstein. And he corrected us. We said Einstein. He said, no, Einstein. Right? And they've just produced Nobel laureates throughout their history. Right? This is a very prestigious school. And he visited our church. And many of you might have been in the Wednesday service this past week. If not, you missed out. You should be there. But during the Wednesday service, he read from Isaiah and he read from the Talmud in Hebrew. Right? It was a very blessed experience, and our missionary, Lee-Gang-gun 선교사님, translated into Korean. But basically, as he read those portions, he extended an invitation for all of us. He said, I want all of you to come to Jerusalem, come to Israel, and see for yourself God's land, the lands that God has provided. And, I visited Israel last year, so I saw firsthand, what a blessing it is to be there and to see for yourself the places and the locations where the Bible actually took place. That's, it's an unforgettable experience. And, I know it's not easy to go by any means, but if any of you have the opportunity, I would say to take it, right? But I do want to disagree with the chancellor a little bit. I can do it now because he's gone. He can't respond. But I want to disagree with him a little bit and say, God's blessing does not reside in Jerusalem. It does not reside in Israel more than it does anywhere else. Because he said that, Jerusalem received 9 portions and the rest of the world received one portion and you're fighting over that one portion. But I don't think that's true. Because for us, as people who believe in Christ, right, we don't believe just in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but we believe also that his son, fully God, is Jesus Christ. And as believers in Christ, we believe that God's presence rests wherever God's people are. Not in Jerusalem, not in the country of Israel, not in the temple, not in some holy mountain, but wherever God's people are, that's where God is, with them. Emmanuel. So whatever place Christians call home, whether it's east or west or north or south, wherever we are, whether it's hot or cold, wet or dry, no matter where we find ourselves, if we have the gospel in our hearts, then that's where God is. That's where God resides. That's where God's church is, and God is with them. But by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. And by faith, he made his home in the promised land. So it says Abraham entered this land that was promised to him, that he would receive as his inheritance, the land that would be passed down through the generations, through his sons and his sons' sons and their sons. But how did he live in that land? You have to pay attention to that. How did Abraham live in the land promised to him? The land that was his inheritance, the land that was the inheritance of all the generations going forward. It says that Abraham lived like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise, the covenant promise. Abraham lived in tents, and so did his sons and his son's son. They lived as strangers in a foreign country. And the word here that they use for made his home is parokeisen in the Greek. And parokeisen in the Greek, it has a deeper meaning than just to say he lived there. Just to say he was, renting a one-bedroom apartment, 20평. He wasn't just living there. Because this word means to sojourn, to live in a place temporarily, but never becoming a permanent resident, to sojourn. And of course, that's where the word sojourners comes from, the movement and the magazine that's famous in America that our senior pastor wrote his dissertation on, right? You guys all know sojourners. So you have to know at least this, right? 이 정도는 아셔야 됩니다. Because our pastor wrote his paper on sojourners. And actually a lot of our visitors, when they come, they say, Reverend Hannah, I've read your paper and I was very impressed. I was very moved, right? That we have a senior pastor who's not just a pastor, and he's a pastor's pastor, right? He has the heart of a pastor, but he's also a recognized scholar, right? That's a huge blessing for us. Mm-hmm. So Abraham didn't just live there, but he sojourned in that land, it says. He sojourned in that land. He lived there, but he did not become a permanent resident. He did not lay down roots in that land. So to put it simply, Abraham, he went and he took possession of this promised land. He went into it and he lived there, but he lived there as a resident alien, not as a citizen. What we call 영주권 versus 시민권, right? He was a resident alien, he was a green card holder, but he was not a citizen. He was a green card holder, but his passport was from somewhere else. Have you ever been at the airport? You can tell where people are from, more or less, by the color of their passport. If you're in Korea, you know what the green passport means. It means that you are a Korean citizen. Wherever you go, if you have that passport, you are a Korean citizen. My passport's not green. I'm not a Korean citizen, right? My passport is navy blue. That means something else. Our passport determines our true country. Even though we go and live somewhere else, we can become permanent residents, we can get, an ID number and an ID card, but we are not citizens of that country as long as our passport remains that color. So Abraham was living there. He was a green card holder, but he was not a citizen. His passport was a different color. And because he knew that, because Abraham remembered that, he remembered who he truly was. He knew that he was a citizen of a different country. A country that transcends borders, a country that transcends languages, a country that transcends even ethnicities. A country that goes beyond time. This is a country that is not based on land. It is not based on the fertility of the land or the ease of transport by rivers. If you look at civilization, right? I'm sure we've all learned about Mesopotamia and the cradle of civilization. All these lands, these countries were formed based on these criteria. How good the soil was, how close the river was, right? A lot of towns or cities, civilizations, are built on high ground to protect it from attack from outside, to give it the strong, the upper ground. Some cities are purposely placed at the intersection of a trade route to ensure prosperity. There's all these different criteria for making a country, but that's not where Abraham lived. That is not the country that Abraham was a citizen of. He was a citizen of a land based on love and grace, compassion and forgiveness, and maybe some thrills, right, as we said. A land that is secured not by the purchasing power of gold or the conquering force of the sword, but by the all-covering blood of Jesus Christ. And Abraham didn't know who Jesus was, but he saw him far off in the distance. Not quite clearly, but he saw him far off in the distance as something promised, something greater than what he had seen thus far. So although Abraham and his sons, he did go into the land, and it says that they dug wells, it says that they pitched their tents, and they set up cities, they dug fields, and they farmed, they tended their flocks in this land. They did all these things, but they never fully settled down because they knew their true home. They knew what color their passport was. So they were waiting for something else. They were waiting for something that was yet to come. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. This promise was not a physical one, but a spiritual promise. The promise of a spiritual land that will be given to them as their inheritance. So as long as Abraham was living here on this earth, he knew that there was something more to look forward to. He knew that Canaan was not the fulfillment, the full fulfillment of God's promise to him. So he lived as a sojourner, not as a citizen. But all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. It tells us in verse 13. Can we admit that we are foreigners and strangers here on earth? That you are a foreigner and a stranger here on earth? Because it's quite easy for us to become familiar and to become comfortable with this world, to trick ourselves into thinking that we are not strangers, that we are not aliens, but we belong to this world. This world is our home. This world has everything that we need. This is the lie of the enemy, that this world is our home, that what we see here is everything that we can expect out of this life, and even in death. When we view our finances, as belonging just to ourselves, as a personal matter, right, an individual matter, then we lose sight of this reality. When our time becomes too precious to give, when worship becomes an obligation, when we do these things, when loving others is an option rather than a command, when the approval of those around us takes precedence over finding approval in God's eyes, when we do all these things, we become too comfortable with this world. We forget that this is not our true home. You know, if we look in Hebrews 11, the chapter that we read today, I encourage all of you to take the time to read it for yourselves. We can't read the whole chapter today, but it lists many great people of faith, from Abel and Enoch to Noah and Moses, Joseph and Gideon, Rabbah and Samson, David and Rahab and Samson, David and Samuel. And it says that they all joined Abraham and his sons in their faith, that these people were together in their faith, and that this faith did not receive the things that were promised. They did not receive the things that were promised, but only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, far off in the distance. And it says that these people were living by faith, and they didn't just live by faith, but they died by faith. That they were still living by faith at the moment when they died, with the promise unfulfilled. We have to think about that. Because sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that faith is something that we have to do until we reach a certain point, until we reach a certain goal in life. Because it's easy to view faith as, being like studying for a test or going on a diet. That if we have this short period of intense devotion and intense discipline, that we will reach the point where we don't really have to try as hard anymore. As long as we get over that hump, then we'll have made it. We'll have arrived. And we can just rest easy. We can just cruise. We can just go on autopilot. But if we want to be truly be people of faith, then we have to live that life of faith. We have to live out that life of faith until the day that we die. Until the day that we die. Because we are hoping and we are longing for something beyond this life and beyond even this death that we will suffer on earth. For we are looking for a better country, a heavenly one. And therefore God is not ashamed to be called our God, for he has prepared a city for us. It tells us in verse 16. So we are called to look to something greater, something beyond. But does this mean that we should just give up on life here and now? I mean, after all, we're not citizens of this world, right? This is not our true home. So why should we care about what happens here? We can just focus on what's ahead. We can focus on the promise, on that far off, distant promise that God has given to us. None of this matters. And that same thought process was something that the early church had a problem with. There were people in the early church thinking that, well, if the promise is for the future, then the present doesn't mean anything. This world is completely meaningless. None of this matters. And recently our senior pastor read the words of Paul when he wrote, "The one who is unwilling to work shall not eat." The one who is unwilling to work shall not eat. And, I remember in New York, I visited a deacon, a 집사님. And in his office, he had this framed on his wall. "Those who will not work shall not eat," right? And I don't know if he truly understood the context of that verse, but our pastor explained it very well, the context behind it. He very accurately pointed out that this wasn't just a wise quote to encourage people to work hard, right? Because it's very easy to misconstrue it as, oh yeah, just work hard, just work hard. The Bible tells us to work hard, 열심히 해. But it goes beyond that. Because this verse was addressing a very real problem in the church community, that people stopped working. And when I mean stopped working, it's not because they were lazy. They stopped working, they stopped cleaning, they stopped taking care of their children, they stopped taking care of their households. I'm sure some of them were very happy to stop showering, right? They just stopped doing anything, everything. They said, it doesn't matter anymore. This life does not matter. This world does not matter. We're waiting for something greater. Come, Jesus, come. Jesus will be back any day now. That was the attitude that these people had. But as the angels told the disciples when Jesus ascended into heaven, the angels came and spoke to the disciples and, snapped them out of their daze. And the angels said to them, don't just stand here staring into the sky waiting for Jesus to come back. Because he will come back, and he'll come back the same way, but your responsibility is not to stand here like, oh, when is Jesus coming back? But go out. Go out into the world. Carry out the mission that Jesus has given to you.
Amen.
This might not be our true home, but we still have work to do while we are here. Temporarily, of course, as resident aliens, of course, but we still have work to do while we are here. So what is it that we are called to do? As I mentioned earlier, I had the opportunity to go to Yongsan this week. I was attending a meeting there with our visitors. But a very interesting thing happened while I was there, because apparently the president of Israel is in Seoul, or he was in Seoul. He was in the city, and he was having an event at the exact same location that we were having our event. So you can imagine what this is like. I don't know if you've ever seen a presidential motorcade or a convoy before, right? Do you guys know what I'm talking about? It's very impressive. I'm sure we've all seen in the movies or in the news, right? Just this huge column of cars transporting the president. And I got to see it up close because I had to wait for them to pass by. But it was just very impressive. First of all, the entire venue where the event was taking place, the entire venue was just covered with Secret Service members. Israeli Secret Service members, Korean Secret Service members. I gotta say, the Korean Secret Service members were a little more 멋있어 than the Israelis, right? And they were all wearing the sunglasses, and they had the mics and everything. And not only them, but I saw SWAT team members, right? SWAT teams. I saw them actually going into the building, and they were just carrying, like huge bags filled with guns. I was like, this is Korea. I don't know if you need that many guns, but they were just carrying bags and bags full of guns, the SWAT team. And there were extra police everywhere, blocking all the entrances, all the exits. And I saw the actual, the convoy itself. In front, they had 6 motorcycle police, right, leading the way. And of course, they all had the Korean flag and the Israeli flag. And following right behind them, there were black SUVs. I think about 4 or 5 black SUVs. Right, it was like just out of the movies. And one of the SUVs, the top even opened, right, for the gunner to come out, right, in, just in case anyone tries something, right. The top opened up, they had the gunner sticking out there. And then there were the 3 presidential limos. 3 presidential limos. And they're all identical, right? Black cars, BMWs. I don't know, Israeli president, German car, I don't know. But he was using BMWs, and they have 3 cars exactly the same, so that you never know which one the president is riding in, right? And each one of those, of course, had the Korean flag and the Israeli flag streaming from the front. And following behind was more black SUVs, and then an ambulance was following also, and then all the way in the back was more motorcycle police. And I hope I can paint this picture in your mind of how big this was, right? How many people there were, right? And I was very impressed, first of all, but I started to wonder to myself as I was waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for them. I started to wonder, is it even necessary to have all this security, to have all this force, all these weapons and people and cars? We're in Seoul. This is not Syria, right? This is not a war zone. Why have all this overwhelming show of force? But I realized it was to make a point. It was to make a point because I didn't know this, but I found out the vehicle carrying the president, right, has, of course, the Israeli flag, as I mentioned, but the vehicle carrying the president and his, cabinet members, VIPs, VVIPs, they call them, actually, those vehicles are considered to be the territory of that country. So that car is Israeli soil on wheels. It moves around, but it's Israeli soil. It doesn't matter if it's in Korea or anywhere else in the world, that is Israeli soil. So this convoy is not just to protect one person. Of course, that's important also, but it's also to project all of the power and the personality and the presence of this country. This is Israel moving. Not just the president, but this is Israel. This is the land, the country, the nation moving in this convoy. And when I thought of it that way, it started to make a little more sense. This car might be in Seoul this week. It might be in America next week. It might be in Europe the week after that. But wherever it goes, it is the land of that nation. As I said a couple of weeks ago, we're all ambassadors for Christ. We're all ambassadors for Christ. We might not be the president, right? But we're all ambassadors.
Amen.
Which means we have an important part to play. We represent the country that we come from. You represent the country that you come from. And wherever you go, you carry the land with you. Just like that president riding in his convoy, wherever you go, you carry the nation with you. You carry all of that land, that identity, that meaning, that purpose with you wherever you go. When you live in a big city like New York, it's a very, very diverse city. And there's a lot of Koreans and a lot of Asians. And I'm sure you know, but it's not always easy to tell who's Korean and Chinese and Japanese. So there's just a lot of Asian people, right? It's not always easy to tell. But if you travel just outside the city a little bit, if you go into the countryside, it's a very different story. There's not a lot of Asian people. There's not a lot of diversity. And there have been many times I'll walk into a restaurant or I'll walk into a store somewhere, like way outside the city, and I'm literally the only Asian person there. Literally the only Asian person there in that store. Maybe in a 50-kilometer radius, right? The only Asian person there. And sometimes the room will literally stop and stare at me like, oh, it's an Asian person. I wasn't expecting that, right? The only Asian person there. And in moments like these, I know very well what it means to be a representative. I know what it means to be the one representing the whole. And I'm very careful. I'm very careful in situations like this. I'm extra careful to be a little more polite than I usually am. I'm a polite person, right? And I'm friendly too, but I'm extra polite. I'm extra friendly. I say, please, oh, thank you, right? And I even tip more generously. I give them more tip, so they will remember that, oh, this Asian guy tipped me well, right? Because I know the responsibility that I have as a representative, right? I'm not just acting for myself, but I stand for much more than just my own self. My actions, right, my mannerisms, the things that I do represents more than just me. And I'm sure many of you have felt that even if you're not an Asian living in America, you felt that at some point in your life, what it means to be a representative of the whole as a one. Maybe you've traveled to a foreign country and you were the only person of your ethnicity there. Or maybe you went somewhere and everyone knew the area of the country that you were from, your hometown. And so you felt like, you had to represent your hometown. Or maybe you went somewhere for work and you were representing your company. Whatever situation it might have been in, you might have been in, we know that we have to pay extra attention to our actions. We have to pay extra attention to what we do in order to give a good impression. Because we are representatives. We are ambassadors. And I don't think that's being fake. I don't think that's putting on an act. But it's simply understanding the responsibility that you have. Understanding, the weight on your shoulders in that situation. What it means to be a good ambassador. Do we understand what it means to be a good ambassador for Christ? There's a quote that is often attributed to Francis of Assisi. No one really knows if he said it or not, but it says, "Preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words." So preach the gospel always, and when necessary, use words. Whether he said it or someone else, the point is that everything we do, everything we say, is a testimony to what God has done in our lives, to who God is in our lives. Everything that we do. It is not just our words that preach the gospel, but every area of our lives can be good news. It can be a gospel message. So I want to ask, when people see your faces, do they see the joy of Christ in your face? And I have to ask this to myself because people say I have a mean face. When people see my face, do they see the joy of Christ in my face? Is that the truth? When people hear our voices, not our words, but when people hear our voices, do they hear the love that Jesus has for the lost? Because sometimes we pay attention to saying the right words, but not to the tone that we use. So when people hear our voices, do they hear Jesus' love? When people see us at work, do they feel the humility of our hearts? When people see us driving, when people see us driving, do they sense the peace that guards our hearts in Christ Jesus? Gia is right. Can you proudly put that Jesus sticker on your bumper and go into traffic? Your life speaks. Your life preaches, whether we like it or not. We are ambassadors for the gospel. To add to the previous quote, there's another that's very similar that says, "Your life is the only Bible that some people will ever read." Your life is the only Bible that some people will ever read. You are the only Jesus that some people will ever see in their lives. You are the only church that they will ever attend. So whether we like it or not, we are moving pieces of God's country. We are moving pieces of God's land, his nation. We are representatives of his kingdom, and we are ambassadors for his crown. So I want to close today's message by recapping that we are longing for a better country, a country that is eternal, a country that is beyond this place, because our true and permanent home is beyond this world. We know that our Father will not be ashamed to be called our God, but will prepare this city for us. And although we are in this world for a time, we are not citizens here. We are simply sojourners. We live here temporarily. But that does not mean we have no responsibility while we are here. We cannot just lay down our tools and say, "Come, Jesus, we are waiting." We have a calling to be God's ambassadors in this foreign land where we live as strangers and aliens. Wherever we go, we carry this nation with us. We carry this land with us, within our hearts, and we are its representatives. So like the great patriarchs and matriarchs of faith that have gone before us, let us remember the words. I want to read them, the words that begin and end chapter 11, where our passage came from today. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us. Let us pray together.